Welcome, everyone. Thanks for your patience. Got the tech issues taken care of, and we are underway. Fingers crossed. It's not flickering anymore. Yes, good. It's working. So I'm Tom Daccord. I'm the co-founder and the CEO of EdTechTeacher. Was a high school history teacher for 15 years in Europe, in my native Quebec, and have been in Boston here for the last 23 years. I taught for 10 years at Noble and Greenough School in Dedham. So over the last 13 years, I've worked very closely with Dr. Justin Reich of the MIT Teaching Systems Lab. So Justin and I were history teachers at Noble's, and we co-founded EdTechTeacher together. And during lunch, I was talking about this session. I was going, you know, Justin, the message really hasn't changed. You know, I might have a few different pictures, a few different slides, but the fundamental message about bringing change and innovation remains relatively constant. In other words, it's hard to do. It is very hard to bring about change, but it happens. And when it does happen, it's wonderful. All right, so we're going to explore this together. So in our years of working with schools and working with districts, all of the questions that we encounter can be encapsulated in sort of three fundamental change questions. So the first one is, why change? In other words, what's the role or the purpose of education technology? The second question is, how do we change? What are the processes? What are the mechanisms that will help bring about change? And the third question is, are we changing? In other words, trying to evaluate, assess whether we're making progress towards our goals. Which of these questions do the vast majority of schools and districts spend most of their time on? Absolutely. How? And it makes sense, right? So we have to decide on purchases. So we have financial economic decisions to make. What do we purchase? And then how do we distribute it? And then, what do we add to it in terms of, let's say, apps? What about privacy? What about security? Is it going to be a take-home device? Does it stay in school? Do we need cards? I mean, there are a whole slew of important how questions, administrative questions that need to be answered. But in all our years of working with schools, we find the schools that are able to progress, in other words, change substantially, are those that focus on the first question. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? So if you don't know why you're doing it, if you don't have a clear goal in mind, then it's very hard to answer the third question, are we changing? Because if you don't know where you're going, how do you know if you've arrived? So what I'm going to do is to sort of point out patterns of stagnation here. So this is from a study that really focused on issues, discrepancies between black and white students in using technology in math classrooms. That was the fundamental focus. But one sort of underlying message is that between roughly 1998 and 2011, the way that math teachers were using technology was essentially the same at the end of those 11 years. So think for a minute about all of the technologies that came about between 1998. What was invented or came about in 1998 that we all use and we rely on right now? So I think I heard it, but Google. So Google, 1998. What else? I heard, just tell me some of the technologies available to not only math teachers, but all of us between 98 and 2011.
The internet.
Yep, internet, sorry? Laptops, blogs, wikis. So we had all the Web 2.0 movement, right, during all of this period. And essentially the study says, well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter how much technology you throw at the teachers. It doesn't matter how shiny it is. It doesn't really matter how, quote unquote, revolutionary it is. They're going to take technology to do exactly what they've always done. So now, March 13th, 2020, right? COVID. So now it's a situation, well, you have to have nothing but technology to teach with. So you're completely immersed in technology. You don't have this, and you don't have paper. But think about what teachers tried to do for the most part. What did they try to do with technology? Recreate their classroom. They tried to use Zoom or Google Meet and try to figure out ways that they could do what they were doing in the... So point number one about any kind of coaching, any kind of leadership, if you lead with tools, probably not going to bring about substantial change. So if the approach is, let me show you this tool, let me show you that platform, let me show you this, their lens is, I'm going to use that to reinforce what I've always done. It doesn't mean that over time they don't make change. And there are some teachers, and I'm sure you know some teachers, right, that at the beginning were like, oh my God, what am I doing? I've never done this before. And maybe 6 months later, 10 months later. But the initial impulse is always going to be, how do I use this new, shiny, revolutionary technology to continue what I've always done? That's the impulse. So there's a limitation of leading with tools. So if there's a limitation in that way, then how do we create the conditions for change? So there are models, there are concepts, there are theorists, experts in business and education and in social realms that can teach us a lot about the conditions necessary for change. So probably the best known is Lewin, probably the world's first organizational social psychologist. And Lewin's model is still very much impactful, especially in the business world, because it lays down some pretty clear conceptual levels or even steps for change. So as you can see in the top right, the first is you need to unfreeze. So in this case, it would be, okay, so how do we unfreeze teachers? So what does that mean? Well, we want them to move, right? So if they're frozen, we have to unfreeze them so that they can move forward. So what we have to do is we have to examine the status quo. So in other words, we're looking at, okay, so why is it that teachers should unfreeze? Why is it that they should change? Let's take a look at the situation now, the status quo, and to try to figure out why they're not moving. Another aspect here is increase the driving forces for change. So you're trying to figure out why they're not moving, and at the same time, you're trying to point out to them reasons why they should be moving. I think often we do spend time on examining the status quo, and we identify reasons why they're not moving. You tell me, why aren't the teachers that you would like to see change, why aren't they changing? Change is scary. Time.
It's easier not to change.
Easier not to change.
Lack of training.
Lack of training.
I think a lot of times administrations just flip over and they're seeing the same thing over and over again.
Yes. Yeah, lots of initiatives, administrator change, or maybe even a lack of leadership. There are all of these elements. So I think we're pretty good at examining and identifying the status quo. Well, we're not necessarily as active and not necessarily as focused is increasing the driving forces for change. In other words, why is it so important for them to change? If that's not pointed out to them, if they don't really understand, if it's not clear to them why not changing is negatively impactful for students, then why change? So that's one aspect that we need to focus on. We also have to decrease the resisting forces against change. I mean, there are various ways of doing this. Leadership is consequential. Figuring out common planning time is important. Focusing on 1 or 2 initiatives and not 6 or 10 initiatives. I mean, there are ways of decreasing those resisting forces against them. All right, so in answering the why change question, you're dealing with the unfreeze. You're dealing with trying to increase, for example, driving forces for change. Now I'm going to flip ahead. I'm not going to get into the move and refreeze here. I'm going to move ahead to John Kotter's model. So John Kotter's model is also influential. It builds on Lewin's. What I like about the Kotter model and Unfreeze, it gives you really 4 parameters here for us to focus on in unfreezing teachers. So establish a sense of urgency. Can you think of something, maybe even something from this morning's presentation, that might create a sense of urgency as to why we might have to change our instructional methods?
Learning loss.
Learning loss could be one. New technologies. Remember that 50% of jobs could be lost. Well, a lot of them will be repurposed jobs, but there's this sense of urgency with automation, especially the acceleration of artificial intelligence with machine learning, that there's going to be tremendous dislocations in the workforce. And so we have to prepare our students for the types of skills and competencies that are going to be needed for that workforce. So there's one way of focusing a sense of urgency on the matter by discussing, reading, viewing, better understanding why it's so important that our students need to develop certain competencies in this changing, fluctuating labor force. Huh?
I want to add, take advantage of urgencies that are already there.
Yes, such as?
6 years ago, the superintendent decided tomorrow to buy 700 Chromebooks, but that didn't give any training, just dumped them off in the schools. That created a real mess.
Right.
Take advantage of that urgency and develop a plan from that. The urgency last year, the COVID-19, that was an emergency. Changes were made there. You take advantage. You see the emergency, take advantage of it in a proper way, make use of those other steps. And take advantage of a situation that forced the hand of some key people.
Yeah, and as you're saying that, I'm thinking about why so many people at this sessions. So how many of you sort of suddenly found yourself in one-to-one environments last year because of COVID, right? And the kids have Chromebooks. And now we're in a situation where, flush maybe with Chromebooks, flush with technology, and we're feeling this sense of urgency. Okay, what do we do? We're in this environment, suddenly in this environment, this influx of technology, and there's this sense of urgency right now. How do we leverage this technology? It's been a significant expenditure of time and money, and we want to leverage it effectively. So yeah, there's urgencies right now. So it's like figuring out what are the senses of urgency that we can focus on, and we can make sure that our faculty understand the importance and the need and the pressing need for change. The second is creating a guiding coalition. So one aspect of leadership that we found it's so prescient is those leaders who can develop a coalition. In other words, they work not simply sort of a top-down directive, but rather build a team around them and consult and collaborate, and together are developing a sense of mission, a sense of purpose, are most effective. Those administrators that sort of come in and say, we want change, and this is the change we want, and this is how we want you to do it, are going to be less effective than those who are working with various constituents, being faculty, being staff, and maybe parents, students themselves, and other stakeholders, working with them and developing a guiding coalition. So as a coach or as an admin, are you developing some sort of coalition that cuts across various constituents in your school or your district? Develop a vision and a strategy. We often tie in vision with mission. If you have a clear vision of the types or the end result, the types of learning that you would like to see happen, if you have that vision and you're able to develop a strategy around that vision, chances are that you will progress more substantially than those who don't. One of the ways that many schools and districts have been developing the vision is the profile of a graduate. How many of your schools or districts are involved in the profile of a graduate? Okay, so we have maybe 10 or so. So the advantage of that is that you're starting with the end in sight. You ask yourself, what is it that we want our graduates to be able to do? What is it that we want our graduates to be able to know, to understand? What kind of people? What are some of the so maybe the social emotional traits and characteristics that we're trying to develop? So we find that those schools and districts who go through this process of identifying the characteristics of a graduate have a sense academically of what they're looking for, also a sense of the kind of people. Now they have a vision